Windows taskbar on the bottom. So I'm going to get started here, knowing that we have only about an hour or so, though I'm happy to stick around longer to chat. But my name's Steve Perkins. I'm the director of the Vermont Historical Society. And today we're going to be talking about Paul Sample. I think you've been seeing in the news, or hopefully been seeing in the news, that this incredible mural that used to be at National Life is now installed here at the Vermont History Museum. We are going to go out there a little bit later on. It's a little silly to look at slides of a beautiful piece of art that's actually in a gallery. So my preface to what we're going to talk about today is that my hope is to put Sample in an art historical context. Talk about his influences, his peers. We'll go into a little bit of biography and look at what shaped him as an artist, the movements, and what was happening in the world leading up to about the time that this mural was painted. So I know that he was a beloved member of the Northern Vermont community, both here in Montpelier, up near Lake Willoughby, and over in Norwich and across the river in Hanover, New Hampshire. So, and there are many people, probably some in this room, that knew him and know those family stories better than I. So I'm not going to delve into family stories. We can talk about that just as a general group, but really looking at him as an artist and what shaped him. So we've also invited Emily Phillips, who's a conservator, who did all the great work on the mural, removed it from the wall, moved it down here, installed it into conservation work. So she's going to talk about what went into that process. We've got a couple of short little time-lapse videos to show you of that. And like I said, we'll try to spend about a half hour to 40 minutes in here, and then we'll go into the gallery and actually look at the art and get into what's being depicted in that painting. So we'll start with a little bit of biography to get started. There won't be a biography in here. I feel bad for the people that are on Facebook Live right now. So Paul Sample, as it says up here on the screen, he was born in 1896. He was born in Louisville, Kentucky. But you know, as a citizen of the United States, I think he would define himself not really from a particular place. His dad was a civil engineer, and they moved all over. So he was born in Kentucky. A couple years later, his brother was born in Indiana. They lived in Oregon. They lived in Washington State. They lived in Iowa and Illinois and New Hampshire and Georgia. So they lived all over the country, and this was before he even got to high school. Ultimately, he attended high school in Illinois. Standout athlete. And that he was a big, strong, strapping guy and really excelled at a number of sports. He followed that real kind of love of sports. He was an okay student. His father, being a trained engineer, encouraged him to go to Dartmouth. So he applied to Dartmouth and he got into Dartmouth College. And he started Dartmouth in 1916. And in his own words, he said, I wasn't a great student, but I was a really good athlete for Dartmouth College. He even picked up the saxophone, and I think this is kind of the first inkling of his artistic ability. Didn't know how to play, didn't know how to read music, but he thought this was a cool instrument. He was able to pick up the saxophone and taught himself how to play it and started playing in small bands on the Dartmouth campus. Of course, there was a big event in the world that happened right around this time, World War I. And like many young men, he did enlist, and he was part of the Merchant Marine throughout the time that the United States was involved in World War I. And out of that, he did gain a love of the sea, and even thought, maybe I will become a captain or a sailor as a career. But upon his father's urging, he didn't just leave college at that point, he did go back. So he went back to Dartmouth and finished his degree. He finished that degree in 1921. He did have a younger brother, and that younger brother, Donald, contracted tuberculosis in 1920 and was sent to a sanatorium in Saranac Lake. For those who don't know about the sanatorium, folks with TB, they would send them to a hospital in an area, usually in the country, that had good air and a place where they could rest and recuperate and have specialized care, fairly common at this time. He went to visit his brother shortly after he graduated from Dartmouth in 1921, and unfortunately contracted TB as well from that visit. So rather than simply visiting the sanatorium in Saranac Lake and leaving, he visited and stayed. And he was in that sanatorium until 1925. So for 4 years of a young man's life, he was bedridden in a TB sanatorium in Saranac Lake. It really affected his health, and his health never really returned in the way it was before. He wasn't this, big, robust athlete anymore. Couldn't do that heavy manual labor that he used to do. So this frailty of health got him thinking while he was in the sanatorium, what do I do with my career? Do I move into, probably not going to be a sailor, maybe not even a civil engineer like Dad, but he found that he really was attracted to the humanities, and he and his brother got talking about the humanities. So writing and poetry and art. And he found that he had a facility for sketching. And this is something new. He had never really taken art classes, maybe here and there in school, like all the rest of us did throughout elementary school and in high school. But he found he had this great ability for sketching. And the head of the sanatorium saw his sketches and said, great, you should take lessons. And it just so happens that there is the wife of at this time, pretty well-known Norwegian-American artist was in the sanatorium. And so this guy, Jonas Lai, who was a neo-impressionist, so you can see the artwork similar to that French impressionist look, but later, early teens into the 20s in the United States. He kind of took Sample under his wing. And he was his first art teacher, and taught him how to work in watercolor, and how to work in oil, how to sketch, how to look at a scene, how to look at light. Lai was, at the time, kind of an old school guy. He was older, again, coming out of this impressionistic background, but he was a realist. And we talk about aesthetic realism, so that you're going to paint what you see, and it's going to be beautiful. And so this idea, this realism, this aesthetic realism, really appealed to Paul Sample. He grabbed onto it, and it was something that he carried with him for the rest of his life. This painting is called Anchored Boats by Jonas Lai, and it was painted around 1920. We don't have an exact date on it. The other thing that happened to Paul Sample while he was in this sanatorium in Saranac Lake was he met a young lady named Sylvia Howland from Montpelier, also had TB, also in the sanatorium. And so that will come up a little bit later in our story. This is a Paul Sample painting called Blue Harbor, painted a little bit later, 1930, but it shows this first influence that Jonas Lai had on him, and the neo-impressionists, and this idea of aesthetic realism. And you can see he's still painting that sea, he's still painting those harbors, like I said, called Blue Harbor, which you can see the definite influences that his studying under Jonas Lai had. When he left the sanatorium in 1925, he left in March of 1925, he decided art was what he was going to do. And he headed down to New York City. He was able to take advantage of veterans money, because he was a veteran of World War I, and used that to pay for some of his art training. So he enrolled at the Greenleaf Art School. He was only there for about 3 months. His brother really kind of took a turn for the worse. His brother was not getting better. And so the family took his brother, they moved to Arizona. You know, is the desert going to be better for him? And then ultimately to California outside of Los Angeles. So Sample and his father in May of 1925 moved to California to go be with his brother. Unfortunately, his brother died on June 17th of that year. So Sample had a couple of months with him before he passed away. Not being tied down anywhere, kind of like in the weather, he decided to stay in California. And again, using that money from as a veteran, he enrolled at the Otis Institute in Los Angeles and studied there for about a year. But as with anything, living expenses started to mount up, and he needed a job. And he applied for and was hired to teach art at the University of Southern California in the fall of 1926. Now, about this time, he was communicating with the young lady that he met at the sanatorium, Sylvia Howland. And they communicated, they wrote letters back and forth. He wrote in his diary that he wanted to get married, but he needed a job. He needed to have some way of supporting a family. So when he was hired at USC, this is the opportunity here. So he asked her to come out, visit him, ultimately asked her to marry him. She said yes, and they married in 1928. And they became somewhat of a bi-coastal family because her family was really all based here in and around Montpelier, so they lived in California but spent a lot of time traveling back and forth across the country, spending summers here in Vermont and up at the family's camps around Lake Willoughby, and then teaching during the school year in Southern California. While in California, his style or subject matter started to change. And this happened both with changes in popular art, but also in what was happening in the world at this time. So he was hired in the fall of 1928. A year later, in the fall of 1929, we had the stock market crash and we roll into the Great Depression. And all sorts of labor issues, unemployment. I mean, I think we all know what the Great Depression was, and it influenced everybody, including artists. So he goes back to this idea of, I'm going to paint what I see. I'm a realist. I'm going to paint the scenes that I see. This is a painting called Unemployment, 1930, and it was painted in 1931. It is similar to a little bit of an earlier movement called the Ashcan School. This is a painting by George Bellows from 1913 called The Cliff Dwellers. Very, very famous painting by George Bellows, used to describe the Ashcan School, which was a social movement in art and looking at what's going on in our world, looking at child labor, our packed cities, tenements, and all of the social ills that are around this industrialization at the turn of the century, based out of New York City. So there are definite comparisons between this type of work from the Ashcan School and what he is showing, especially even with his title, calling it Unemployment. But Sample, in his writings, public and also personal, didn't really ever espouse too many political ideas. So he wasn't as activist as the Ashcan School artists were. So he was painting in their style. So a great exhibit and exhibit catalog written in 1988 for an exhibit at Hood described his work as the Ashcan School with a California light. So I think that's a good example of comparing his piece to the Ashcan School here. This is another painting of the same time period, 1 year later, called Speech Near Brewery in 1932. Again, he's showing some of this social unrest, and he's depicting it on the street, but he's also spending a lot of time looking at these buildings and the massing and the colors in those that brings to mind other movements in the 1920s that's looking at the beauty of the industrial landscape. So he's starting to blend different styles that he's seeing. The book that was written in 1988 to accompany the exhibit, the main essay was written by Professor Robert McGrath, which I pulled a lot of this from Dartmouth. And he described Sample's work rather than social realism, which was what the Ashcan school was. He described it as social aestheticism. So he's taking what he sees, and maybe there's some social unrest, but he's making it beautiful, and he's painting this scene. As the Depression deepened, ideas in American art changed and thinking changed. In the art world, there was this kind of undercurrent that these great kind of thinking styles, these avant-garde styles that came out of the cities were part of the problem that created the Great Depression. So in folks' minds, this depression came out of excesses. It came out of problems in New York and Chicago, and all these issues with labor and finances all have to do with this high-minded intellectualism and fast living. And so how do we get away from that is that we depict America's heartland, and especially the Midwest. And the Midwest was depicted a lot in the early 1930s, and the movement became known as American regionalism. And it was saying we have these regions in our country that truly describe the American spirit. And they're what's going to bring us out of this depression, and it's what's good about our country. And Sample really latched onto this, especially with his constantly going back and forth to Vermont. And he took this regionalist idea, like he said, that it showed the Midwest, these farmers of the Midwest as the backbone of the country, and he applied it to his adopted home of Vermont. This painting is called Church Supper. It's from 1933. And again, he was still living in California at the time, but spending a lot of time in Vermont. Supposedly there are people and places in here that are from outside of Montpelier. This lady, keep her in mind. She shows up a lot in his artwork. I think everybody's seen this painting, American Gothic by Grant Wood. Grant Wood's probably one of the most famous American regionalists, and working out of Iowa, never really leaving Iowa, except for a few trips to Europe to look at other paintings. But in saying that these are the rock ribs of our country, and so we paint it and depict our American experience. This is another Grant Wood piece, Arbor Day, from 1932. And you can see the similarities in his work to Sample's work if you look at the landscapes and the weird perspectives and the kind of sausage-like drawing of people. Here's another artist that you've probably heard of, Thomas Hart Benton. This is a little later, 1938. It's called Cradling Wheat, but similar to his works that he did throughout most of the 30s. And again, one of these American regionalists that most of us have heard about, a contemporary of Paul Sample's, and certainly an influence upon his work. And and I would argue that his work influenced these other artists as well. All of them looked back towards Peter Bruegel the Elder, who was a Flemish artist working in the 16th century. These regionalists saw his work with peasants. This is called Peasant Wedding Feast from 1568, as the perfect European comparison to American regionalism. And so if you look at this, they all said, yeah, we love this guy. They copied his stuff. They went to Europe to look at his artwork. And you compare that to Church Supper, you can start to see that influence that Sample had from Bruegel. So I'll just kind of go back and forth a little bit. You look at the the diagonal composition with the two different diagonals coming together, a central figure that somewhat stops those diagonals, and then just the subject matter of people enjoying a meal and talking and living in this agrarian lifestyle. And here we go. Here is Vermont. Where's the factory? Where's the train? Where's the cars? Remember, we're talking 1930s. These things were fairly common, but they're not here. So this one of his most famous early works, and really got him noticed as an artist on the national scene. Here's another piece called Janitor's Holiday from 1936. He was still in California in 1936 and coming back to Vermont. It is a Vermont scene, and again, it's agrarian. It's people teeming the countryside. They're working hard. They're living a beautiful lifestyle, and it's not influenced by all the ills that we're seeing around that's happening at this time. This piece, along with this painting called Beaver Meadow, were both won a number of awards. They were at the World's Fair of 1938. They were shown in numerous galleries in New York. And he started, this was starting to be the height of his fame. At this time, USC gave him a sabbatical, and so he took the year of 1937 to 1938, and he and his wife Sylvia went to Europe, and they traveled around actually looking at the Royal paintings and a lot of Northern Renaissance, which was influencing to these American regionalist paintings before coming back. Never went back to California. He came back to Vermont, ultimately Hanover, and he was hired by Dartmouth as their first artist in residence in 1938. And so fall of 1938, he was given a studio at Dartmouth, and he stayed at Dartmouth for the rest of his career. Had a small apartment in Hanover, ultimately moved and had a home in Norwich. This painting here, painted in 1939, shortly after they moved. He lived near Beaver Meadow, which was a village in Norwich. And again, take a look at this lady. She's from Beaver Meadow, and she finds her way into a lot of his paintings. This painting really was felt that it showed kind of true Vermonters. He has started to move some of these newfangled automobiles into here, but you still have, the church in the valley, the gravestones that are showing this. It's been settled for a long time, the farms, and this Vermonter is the image of a Vermonter that we just see everywhere, not only in Sample's work, but in photographs and movies. When someone said, "Who's that Vermonter?" He's the guy with the hat tipped back on his head. He's kind of lean and lanky with a big Adam's apple, and he's saying, "Hey, things are going all right." I wanted to show you this painting. It's like the other ones, it fits into our greater scheme of how he fits into art, but it relates to a scene in the mural. So I just wanted to point this out, and you can take a look at this and look at how he adapted this painting into the mural that was done about 20 years later. So this was painted, what is the date on this? It's 1939 or 1940. The title is Matthew 6, verse 19, or in parentheses, the auction. And this is something that was happening in Vermont a lot, and I think he was very sensitive to it, and I think a lot of Vermonters were too. It's an estate sale. The farm has gone out of business, and everything's being sold. Here's the farmer up in the bed with his dog, looking down on his estate being sold. And I think there's this interesting nod to there's a fair amount of artwork being sold. The verse, and I'm actually going to expand the verse, Matthew 6, I'm going to expand it from 19 through 21, because that's usually the verse that's referenced, is do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth where moths and vermin destroy and where thieves break in and steal, but store up for yourselves treasures in heaven where moths and vermin do not destroy and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. So, maybe he's calming himself, he's making this, he's saying, don't worry about it, it's just belongings, but certainly reacting to something that's happening fairly often in these hills of Vermont at the time. So, I would say at 1938, 1939, 1940, Paul Sample was at the height of his career. Everybody wanted a Paul Sample. His works found their way into numerous museums throughout the country, and then he started to pick up more commissions for murals, commissions for public art, and then really kind of put food on the table, also commissions to paint for magazines. And so, this is similar to your Norman Rockwell, who did this kind of work. So here is some images. I grabbed these out of a magazine article. I found the magazine. We have it in the archives at the Vermont Historical Society library over in Barrie. It's a great, the paintings, they're watercolors, he was working in watercolor, were wonderful, but also the article is great. If you want to read an article that is American regionalism in writing, and then you can see it in images, check out this article. So it's a 1939 summer issue of Fortune magazine. And the article was about a farmer named Dean Hoisington. That's how he said it. Dean said it Hosington, his wife said Hoisington. That's in the article. They commissioned Sample to paint kind of a year in the life of the Hoisington farm, and the author wrote about the year in the life of the Hoisington farm. And the premise was, unlike the Midwest and the West, where farming is a cash crop, where you're going to make money, you're going to grow. In Vermont, it was just subsistence. You could have a good living, but you had your farm, you managed it well, you lived, and you passed it on to your kids. They managed the farm, and they lived, but you weren't expanding, you weren't growing. It wasn't a cash industry. That was the crux of the article, and that goes back to that idea of regionalism and how we live our lives. The watercolors in this article are just beautiful, and I scanned a few in here. That's a portrait of Hoisington there. Here's the Hoisington children with the barn on the hill. He worked a lot. When he worked quickly, and especially on assignment, he worked in watercolors. And here's looking down on the farm in the winter. So another world war broke out. Sample was a little old to enlist, but his fame brought him commissions. So he was commissioned by Time Life to travel throughout both the Atlantic and the Pacific theaters and do sketches for the magazines. And this was a painting that he created that came out of a sketch that was painted in 1944. It's called Field Hospital in a Church. He also entitled it Delirium is Our Best Deceiver. You can see a change, in what he saw in this war. This field hospital is mostly diseased soldiers, not necessarily injured soldiers depicting here, but the relationship to church, the relationship to what's happening in this war, so the twisted figures, and but then here's a lady again, and I've been told that this is his wife and his son Tim, also in the painting. But you've got some modernity coming in here, but then this could be from whenever. It could be Hieronymus Bosch. This is Last Judgment by Hieronymus Bosch. Again, like I said, this Northern Renaissance was an influence upon the regionalists and certainly upon Sample. So this triptych was painted in 1482. It's kind of dark, but you can see lots of great images. It's really big in popular culture. It's all these twisted souls and moving their way up to heaven if they can make it there after all these trials and tribulations of the earthly paradise on the left, or the paradise on the left, and hell on the right, and purgatory, and trying to get one place or the other in the middle. You compare that to his painting here, and we have this church scene over here, and we start to see these kind of modern paradise, or the living world here. But then is this purgatory? Is this field hospital his place for purgatory? Came back from the war, continued to paint in this realist mode. He liked to paint what he saw. He loved his landscape. And after World War I, that's really what he focused on. So it was less about painting social issues. It was more about painting this beautiful Vermont landscape, or upon commission, maybe a beautiful Midwestern or Southern landscape. But more and more, staying here at his studio in Vermont and painting what he saw. This is maple sugaring. It's a little out of focus. I had to grab it off the internet. It's privately owned, so we don't have a really good image of it. But I wanted to show you this, of how famous Paul Sample was right around World War II. So he painted this painting. That painting became the image for Vermont maple syrup cans for 50 years. So there's a different image on it now, but for 50 years, this maple syrup image was the image that represented Vermont maple syrup to the world, and that was Paul Sample. So critically, what was happening? So we had all of this Great Depression leading up to World War II, all these privations and depredations, and then just the horrors of war. That all really related to his regionalist style and looking at this beautiful landscape and how do we get back to that. Well, after World War II, we came back and the country just went into like crazy overdrive. Cities exploded. People became, going to the GI Bill, moving into the suburbs. The space race was on, and so from an art standpoint, the art world moved on. The art world moved on to the biggest movement at the time was abstract expressionism. So this is just a catalog cover that I happen to have. But Steele, Pollock, de Kooning, Rothko, Newman, Klein, we all know these names, really famous modern artists in their own sense. But how many of us still remember Paul Sample? His way of painting, his style of painting, was no longer the critical darling. It was beautiful. It was used for illustrations. It was used for historical work, but it fell out of favor from a critical sense. He continued to work. He continued to paint. He was still the artist in residence at Dartmouth up until 1958, when National Life came knocking. There's a little connection there. Sylvia Howland's father, Fred Howland, was CEO of National Life in the 1920s and 1930s. So there's a family connection. And Dean Davis, who was the president and CEO of National Life at the time, later governor of Vermont, approached Sample about creating a work of art that represented the full sweep of Vermont history for their brand new headquarters, which the cornerstone was laid in 1958 up here on the hill. So I would say it was probably his last great work. It's big. It's 8 feet by 50 feet long. He had some heart trouble actually during the commission and had to slow down. So it ended up not even completing it until 1961, but he did. And his health continued to decline for the rest of his life, and he slowed down painting. He still did, but no more huge commissions, no more big shows, and really tied into Dartmouth and a great friend of the university there. Ultimately dying in 1974. So he did live a very long life. Again, height of his artistic work was in the late 30s and early 40s. And we're seeing that holdover from that regionalist style. We like holdovers in Vermont, right? We're always about a decade behind and everything anyway, in this large mural. I'm going to stop there. We're going to go out and talk about the mural in the gallery, which is a lot more fun. That's only a small piece of it. But I want to invite Emily up to talk about the piece itself. So it was installed at National Life. It was glued to a large wall in their lobby meant to anchor that headquarters and tell the history of Vermont. And just as a piece of introduction, the company is doing some renovations there, and it really wasn't well taken care of in the lobby. They wanted to see it preserved. And so it was given to the Vermont Historical Society, and National Life underwrote the removal, the conservation, and the installation of that mural here. So, Emily.
Hi everyone, can you hear me okay? I've got allergies. I just want to give a little background about myself. I'm a painting conservator in private practice. I have a master's degree from Buffalo State College in the field of art conservation with a specialty in paintings. I actually started here in Vermont in the field. I have a tendency to gravitate towards large-scale projects. I worked on the Painted Theater Curtain project back when it started in 2002. 15 years ago, and moved on to Boston and worked on another mural project there at Trinity Church in Copley on a series of Lafarge murals. So when I got called in to look at this, it's probably not the largest, but it certainly is, from an engineering point, probably the biggest mural I've ever had to move. So I did call in a mentor of mine that I worked with in Boston, Gianfranco Pocobene, and he came up, and so when I say we throughout this description of the process, I'm really talking about the team of conservators and technicians that were involved in this as well, not just myself. And so I like to think of conservation as a three-legged stool. We're part scientist, part art historian, and part artist. The first step that we took looking at the mural was understanding the construction of it and then understanding the condition of it. One of the reasons why I think I appreciate Paul Sample so much is that he was a great record keeper of the materials that he used. He laid out the type of paints that he had used to paint this, so there wasn't really a lot of guessworking, and the type of adhesive that he used to mount the painting to the wall, like the granite berry or something of that reference. It was never supposed to be coming off, and it added to a little challenge when we were doing the removal process. So looking at the construction of it, we photo document all of the work, and then really looking at how is this going to come off? And this is one process that took quite a bit of time and really didn't come into finality as to how this was going to happen until we really knew where it was going to end up. And so we did actually talk about taking this out as one whole wall. I don't know if you've seen the Avi Zadig, if I pronounced that wrong, a synagogue piece, but they actually took the whole piece out as one and removed it and moved it to a new site. So we had looked at that. We looked at many other different removal processes, and until we learned that this was going to really need to be on a curved wall, we decided to remove the entire canvas. So the painting is actually an acrylic paint on linen canvas adhered to the wall in a technique that we call mariflage. It's a very standard mural technique for mounting canvas onto a wall. It's how most of the murals are attached to state capitol buildings and really high places. So he would have done this in his studio and then transported it up here to Vermont. I think at the time, was he working in Dartmouth on this?
Yeah, he painted it in the studio.
And there's pictures of him working in studio on this. So not done on site, not like a fresco. And so once we learned that it was going to be coming to the pavilion building, and then a little bit of a curveball thrown in there with the actual curvature of the wall, because this is a 50-foot span of painting that could really only be accommodated by having a curvature to the wall. Did we realize that it had to come off the canvas coming off of the wall? So I don't know if we have a very fast time-lapse video of the actual removal process. It did not. It was a little bit slower. That's the read. Oh yeah. Okay. And if you have any questions, please ask. Yes?
I'm just curious, is it one piece of wood?
Oh, so the other thing I was going to add to this, which made it much easier to handle, because once you start unrolling this, it does get quite heavy. There are actually two 25-foot sections.
Oh.
There's a butt join in the middle that he quite nicely used one of the maple trees, one of the tree lines.
Oh, my, that's in the way. Here it is on site in...
So we literally had a whole, we had to do this over a weekend because National Life's very busy during the weekday, and we literally had to set up a Friday after office hours and get it down by Sunday so that they could get the wall prepped and painted and new photographs on. So it was a very long, tiring weekend. So we used typically when you roll painting, which is used to move large-scale work, you always want to roll the painting face out. In this case, we used a large enough diameter roller that we weren't worried about compressing the paint layer too much, that we could roll the painting face in as we were removing. So we actually went between the canvas itself and the wall, which was metal lath with plaster. And we just used a spatula, like a frosting spatula, to work in between the two, in between that area, and just break the adhesive bond, and just slowly, with this big tube, I don't know if I have a pointer, but this big tube here, which is about 30 inches in diameter.
Like filleting?
This here, it's about 30 inch in diameter and about 10 feet high on roller, on casters. We use that to slowly roll the canvas off as we worked the spatulas behind. And we really left with no knuckles at the end of the weekend.
Is there some scientific formula to determine what the diameter needs to be to not do damage?
I think we were looking for a few factors. One, large enough diameter, but also, we did have to move it into a van. There was mobility issues getting into the building, handling anything larger probably would have been very difficult. Anything smaller probably would have just been a little bit too tight of a circumference for us to be rolling around. So
I think ideally it's no bending.
Yeah.
But we had to say, okay, what's the largest we can get away with and still fit it in a van and get it.
And this was just for the removal. Once we took it off the wall, we unrolled it and then rolled it face out onto the roller. So it didn't stay this way for more than the period of it being upright and being removed from the wall. I will also add that I think one of the two saving graces of this project from our point of view as professionals was the flexibility of acrylic paint is fantastic. If this was oil paint, it would have been a whole nother set of problems. The canvas that he used was really heavyweight. It was just, it wasn't brittle. It was really just supple and a really nice material to work on. So I will say that the quality of the materials that he used for such a large scale painting, it was really nice to see. And for it to come here, and yeah, so I think, is this the time lapse?
It is, but I
Do,
think-
but now it's not.
But now it's
We're
not.
not painting now.
It's basically just a time lapse showing us actually removing
I don't know if
it off very
that's
quickly.
They played before.
Maybe you only played once.
So then the question was, once we got it off the wall, so this was back in October, and they kind of went into hibernation until things got moving with the construction of the space. The wall was built, we transported them into a van to the Berry building. There's everybody actually hiking them up the stairs and how to get it up into the building, elevator. They're actually pretty heavy. We did two different rollers, so we put each 25-foot section on a roller and made these handles, kind of like carrying a coffin, I guess, or something.
They weren't light.
No. And we used a material Tyvek to interleave and roll it up. So So I guess this was the wall before
This is
the
before.
curb got put in.
Yeah, our sales shop, if you remember, was in this room. At the point this picture was taken, we removed the sales desk and the sales furniture. But other than that, that's the room as it is, with the infamous power box.
Oh.
That was the bane of our existence. Yeah, so there's a power box right here. That's one of my favorite stories now that we've taken care of it. And the power box dates to 1971. The space has been renovated numerous times since 1971, but no one ever touched that power box. And we kept looking and said, why can't we just get rid of the power box? Just move it says 2 breakers in it. Breakers run stuff in the bathroom. Can't we just move those breakers? Well, it turns out the main power line that runs this entire building comes into the basement and runs up a chase right here. And there was a junction or a break in the line where this power box is, and you can't cover that. And so the easiest thing to do was just don't touch the box. So no one ever touched the box. Well, we need to cover the box because we're going to put a mural on it. So we had to, and of course, at this time, we had to shut this whole building down. And at the time, we just elected, the new governor was sworn in. So his whole transition team was working. The building was being used day in, day and night, all week long. Finally, we were able to get a day. And it was, I don't know, it was a Sunday? And so we were able to get the ability to shut the building down. So 7 o'clock in the morning, the main power line coming into this entire building was shut down so that we could snake a new line from the basement all the way through so there would be no junction here and finally eliminate the box. And that was some of the things you run into with.
So we were going to wait until all that stuff got taken care of before we started to reinstall the mural. And during this process of kind of waiting from October until then, we really started to work through, what are our options to get this back mounted onto the wall. This is a permanent installation. Because of the curvature of the wall, it really did shrink down the types of mounting options. We looked at Velcro at one point, which is a really different technique that's used in the curtain project, and even magnets these days are being employed, so that there's some availability to remove the painting. But once we really decided that this was going to be the weight of it alone really needed an adhesive, and part of the other ethical boundaries, guidelines that we have to strive for is some effort of reversibility, and also using materials that are not similar or can be removed, that won't cause damage to the existing materials of the painting itself. So acrylic paintings are really new, not so new, but he was really using this at the very start of when acrylic paintings were just coming in. This was done in a brand called Liquitex. It's a little bit different than working with an oil paint. There's different sensitivities. We had to look at what type of solvents could be used on it, because we're working in a public space. We didn't really want to use anything too toxic, and so we were really looking at something water-based or in mineral spirits, which are much healthier for you than, say, acetone or any of the organic solvents. So this is me working on it face down. So this is the back of the painting. So all of the white patches are all the adhesive residue. What I'm doing here is we decided for several reasons to roll on an acrylic resin onto the back. One, we felt that it was really important to prime the canvas. We were really concerned that because we were using an aqueous mounting adhesive, that we didn't want any risk of shrinkage of the canvas, which could then cause contraction of the paint layer. And I really wanted to be able to consolidate some of the adhesive residue. It was very powdery, and we just didn't want to have to deal with that when we were doing the reinstallation. And then the third reason was I wanted to have something that could possibly migrate through into the paint layer a little bit to just add some adhesive property. And if I'm getting too technical on these terms, let me know. But because we were mechanically using a spatula to run behind the canvas, we weren't mechanically, not fracturing, but we were, the painting really went through quite a bit of stress. And so we really wanted to make sure that any of those failure points had an adhesive or had something to help reduce the possibility of future lifting paint or flaking paint issues. So then the next big question was, after this, how do we get it on the wall, and how could we make this easier in the future if it does need to be removed, so that we don't have to have somebody go through, and hopefully it won't be me, go through the same thing of removing the painting from it. So we decided to use a product that's designed specifically for conservation. It's an aqueous adhesive that has a thermoplastic property, so you can actually reheat it. And you'll see us later on. I think there's pictures of us with using an iron on the front. But one of the really important things, and if you just go back for a minute, that we decided to do was we decided to add a layer in between the painting itself and the wall. We call it an interleaving material. It's kind of like a sacrificial layer. It's actually like the interface material that you use on sewing. It's called rime. And so we mounted that to the wall first, and we just felt that if this ever needed to come off, that could be a point that somebody could get behind, rather than going straight to the canvas, to the painting itself. So this is what we applied 50-foot length of this material onto the wall first, using the adhesive that we're rolling on here. And this is Jeff and Gianfranco and myself. And then keep going down. And then it was just an engineering feat of, how are we going to get this on the roller at the right height so it gets onto the wall level and straight and with a curve. And while we're also rolling adhesive on the back of it. And so this is us getting it ready to be positioned onto the roller, so that we slowly controlled, unrolled it, and then adhered it to the wall. And this is the whole game here. We used linen tabs on the top to keep the painting onto the roller, and then we slowly started to unroll it as we had, just like hanging wallpaper in a weird way.
Sideways.
Sideways. So just that we would roll adhesive here, and then slowly start to roll it out, and then two of us would come to the front of it and start confirming the bond of the painting to the wall. And then going back even later into the process, using irons on a very low setting. If anyone was watching us live, we were debating if we should be on the wool setting or the silk setting, what was kind of working for us at that time. But acrylic paint is really nice, as you know. It's what we use on house paint, essentially. It actually can withstand quite a lot of heat. We were using a material called silicone release mylar between the iron and the paint itself, so there was something between them, so we weren't risking overheating the painting or having the iron stick to the painting. So we really worked out how much heat we really needed to have. So this is us getting to the end of the first section, which took a lot of time working out the process, and then I think this is kind of, yeah.
There we go.
We did not work this fast. I only wish. So that would have been the first half. And then the second half was very challenging because we were in the middle of the curve and we had the join that we had to line up. And so it took a little bit of finagling. We were really fortunate because just like a jigsaw puzzle, it was actually, he actually used a very jagged line to hide that join, and it actually just acted like a locking mechanism. It just kind of set in place. Yeah, we were very excited. we had a really good crew, and then what the photos don't show here was the work after we got it up. I came back for a couple of days and surface cleaned it. It had been in a space that, and as you can see, because of the stanchions there now, that won't be an issue here, but at National Life there were catering events where tables did get placed pretty close to the mural, so there was quite a lot of drips and food accretions and splatters of things. So, and then just some really minor in painting. As a conservation project, the condition of the painting was actually in really good condition, very stable. So, again,
And it's beautiful. It's,
yeah.
So.
I'm just curious, is there a record about how sample got it up?
You know, I don't know. Traditionally, that probably would have been left up to wallpaper hangers. I don't know if he has any record of.
There's images of it being hung.
Yeah.
We have an archive of National Life. And he was dressed up and was kind of standing here.
Yeah.
There were a couple of guys that in typical painter's garb of 1961 who were doing the work. Yeah.
And did he come back and paint the scene when it was up?
He did. Yeah. So once it was
I
up,
was wondering if he came back and touched that up.
he did, and there's an image of him doing that in that archive. He came back. He touched up the seam where the two pieces come together, and then the other piece that happened was it all got hung, and it turned out I can't remember, it was 2 or 4 inches too long, because they'd already put this they got this frame all set for it. So he just cut it off. I think he cut it off this end, the blue end, and then he cut the strips up and gave them to people as souvenirs.
We measured 3 times and we never had to cut. Anyway. No, it actually went up. I mean, it went up like we had worked out many times. And I have to say that the space here is so nice to actually stand in front of, and you really get now an appreciation. I mean, I stood in front of it for hours, and now that it's in a more intimate setting, and not between an elevator and a cafeteria and a lobby way with thousands of people running back and forth, you can really appreciate it.
Where are his archives at Dartmouth? Like, where did you find his specificity about the paint used, etc.?
That actually came up at National Life. They have really good records of all of his work on the mural. So
That was VHS.
yeah. Which came.
The gift from National Life, I just can't say enough about that. Not only did they give us the mural and underwrite the Emily's time, as well as the renovations that need to take place in this building to install it, but they also donated all of their archive that relates to the mural. So in the gallery, you'll see we've got photographs, we've got just a handful of sketches, we've got many more, some beautiful scale cartoons that he did, and trying, and I think probably pitched ideas and pitching it to various executives at National Life. And so that all came to the Historical Society as well. So we have a nice archive. Really, if you want to study his life, that information is all at Dartmouth. So we're at 1 o'clock. I know we said we had an hour. I would love to go into the gallery, so if anyone wants to stay with us, you've got to go great. If you want to stay with us, happy to go into the gallery. Emily and I will go in. We can do a quick overview of the mural and maybe just have more of an informal talk about that.